Once again, we people who are trying to live together on this small, vulnerable, precious planet are mired down in war. War in Ukraine, now well into its second year, and then starting 3 weeks ago in Gaza, the Israeli-Hamas war. And it's a challenge to think morally in wartime, with all the fog of war and all the disinformation. It's hard to even sense the Spirit of God sometimes in wartime. It's almost like the Spirit withdraws from the earth in sorrow and grief at times like these. And I remember a song sung by Bette Midler years ago now called From a Distance. From a distance, we all have enough, and no one is in need. And there are no guns, no bombs, and no disease, no hungry mouths to feed. From a distance, we are instruments, marching in a common band, playing songs of hope, playing songs of peace. They're the songs of every man. God is watching us. God is watching us. God is watching us from a distance. From a distance, you look like my friend, even though we are at war. From a distance, I just cannot comprehend what all this fighting is for. From a distance, there is harmony, and it echoes through the land, and it's the hope of hopes. It's the love of loves. It's the song of every man. It's the hope of hopes, the love of loves, the song of every man. And God is watching us. God is watching us. God is watching us from a distance. Oh, God is watching us. God is watching. God is watching us from a distance. Now, today that song still speaks to me, not in its every line, but this notion of God is watching, but from a distance. When I watch the towering pillars of smoke illuminating the nighttime skies in Gaza, I am filled with very mixed feelings. I care about the security of Israel. But I also feel a deep and heavy sadness for anyone anywhere on earth, that anyone anywhere on earth should ever experience even one such night of terror from the skies. And I think of children, and I think of parents in Gaza and in Israel, whose only concern tonight is the simple safety of their own families. Could they go home tonight and just feel safe one night, like we do practically every night? And I am sad for them. But one thing I know is that the Spirit of God has not withdrawn from the earth, and that God is not watching us from a great distance. In fact, God is not removed from us. God shares the agony and suffering of Ukrainians and Russians, of Israelis and Palestinians. God is with the mother trying to shield their child from the blast. God is with the tortured hostage longing to be free. God is with the diplomat pacing the midnight hour. And God is with the child with nightmares of fire falling from the sky. God is not removed from us. This is the truth of the crucified God, that behind all the events of our lives, there is the broken body and the shed blood of Christ, really. And that is what is meant by the real presence of God in communion. It's an important concept, so important to how we live our lives, not just in this moment, but every moment through the week. And that's the underlying truth in our series this autumn on where the Spirit of the Lord is. The Spirit of God is always right here, as close as the air we breathe. No, closer. The Spirit of God is within us. This morning our text is 1 Corinthians 13, and it contains Paul's great section on love. It's a favorite text at weddings. It's one of my favorite texts at weddings. And at most wedding ceremonies, I will say marriage is a kind of God-given space in which love is learned. You anchor this one relationship in a covenant. You bind yourself to make it through everything together. Nothing counts against you. Now, I'm repeating some of this morning because at weddings I'm never quite sure if people are gawking or listening. But in marriage, you learn to forgive. You have to forgive. You have no choice. You're in covenant. In marriage, God teaches us, and only God can, that love is patient, love is kind. It does not envy. It does not boast. It is not proud. It is not rude. It is not self-seeking. It is not easily angered. It keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. Love never fails. And so weddings are times when I will turn to 1 Corinthians 13. There was another circumstance that led me back in the day, way back in the day, to 1 Corinthians 13, and that's when, for reasons no longer clear to me, I would turn there to prove that tongue speaking had ended. Well, historically, that was probably never true, but I would go there to make that point. And I would focus on verses 8 to 10. But where there are prophecies, they will cease. Where there are tongues, they will be stilled. Where there is knowledge, it will pass away. But we know in part, and we prophesy in part, for when the perfect comes, the imperfect disappears. And I would make the case that the perfect was, of course, the Word of God. So that when the canon, the New Testament canon of Scripture was completed in, say, AD 95, at the very moment the ink dried on John's parchment on Revelation, tongue speaking stopped in mid-sentence. Some poor guy on the far side of the Mediterranean was aglow with the Spirit, and suddenly the juice dried up. Of course, I was wrong. It's doubtful that Paul was trying to date anything, though he does write down the prophecies will cease and that tongues will be stilled. But he also says that knowledge will pass away. It makes me think of social media today. Maybe he has a point. It makes me think of QAnon and various other conspiracy theories in general. I hope that hasn't happened, that knowledge has passed away, though some days I do wonder. My mistake was asking a text to answer a question that it was not written to answer. And that's probably mistake number one in interpreting Scripture, and I was making it. Don't do that. But don't ask texts to answer questions they weren't written to answer. In any case, Paul in 1 Corinthians 13 is making a far larger point. You see, the perfect in Greek, totelion, means the complete or the mature, suggesting that when we get to completion, the partial will drop away. The partial won't matter. When we get to maturity, so much will just drop away. When we see God face to face, when we shall know fully and be fully known, so much that matters now won't. A lot of stuff that worries you now won't. A lot of stuff that thrills you now probably shouldn't. What was Paul's big point? What really mattered to Paul? Paul's big point is that love never fails. In verse 8 and then in verse 13, now these three remain: faith, hope, and love. Faith, hope, and love, which are the highest energies of the universe, the energies that sustain conscious life on earth. As many have long known, faith is physiological. Hope is physiological. Love is physiological. These are the things that matter: faith, hope, and love, but the greatest of these is love. That is Paul's point. What Paul is saying in 1 Corinthians 13 is that love is the undeniable essential of Christian life and faith, and love must control the exercise of all the gifts of the Spirit, how and when those gifts are used. Now, this text is not a lovely, sentimental meditation on the nature of love. In fact, in context, the tone is one of exasperation. The context is spiritual gifts. These spiritual gifts that we all have. We talked about that a month or so ago. These spiritual gifts that we all have, Paul says. And we noted then that the problem is that we all have them, but few of us actually know it. And that's what makes the big difference. These God-given talents that maybe we're born with, or that maybe we acquire over time, or that maybe rise in response to any task to which the kingdom of God calls a person. This section on love follows naturally from chapter 12 and leads naturally to chapter 14, both of which are heavy on spiritual gifts. The necessity of love is a lesson that is particularly important when spiritual gifts are being learned. When people realize that they are gifted by God, that God has given them all the resources they will ever need for life, they can get pretty excited and sometimes arrogant and sometimes ironically full of themselves if they do not remember that it all comes down to love. And in fact, in 1 Corinthians 13, Paul is reprimanding the Christians in Corinth. First, he emphatically says that the best things that you could ever do are futile if you do not have love. You may speak with the tongues of men and of angels, the very language spoken in heaven, but it's nothing if you do not have love. It's useless. It's a noisy gong. It's a clanging cymbal, he says. It's an old hot rod backfiring down the street. You know, I live next to Scalzi Park, and there's always, noisy gongs, clanging cymbals, old hot rods backfiring down the street. You may understand all mysteries and all knowledge. You may be the smartest person in the room. You might be. But it's nothing if you do not have love. You may have faith to move mountains, Paul says. You may give all that you possess to the poor. You may even surrender your body to the flames. You may be considered by all sorts of people a spiritual giant. But none of this matters if you do not have love. And then Paul defines the love that he's speaking of. He starts with two positives. Love is patient. Love is kind. But the force of his argument is found in the 8 negatives that follow. Love is not envious, which is the same language that Paul applied to the contentious Corinthians in chapter 3, verse 3. For as long as there is envy and quarreling among you, are you not of your lower nature? Love is not boastful, which echoes Paul's repeated reprimands of the Corinthians for boasting. Love is not proud or puffed up, which is precisely the words that Paul has used already to castigate the Corinthians over and over. And Paul goes on listing the relational patterns of the church in Corinth. Love is not rude. Love is not self-seeking. Love is not easily angered. Love keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices in the truth. And then Paul concludes that love is always protective, always trusting, always hopeful, and always persevering. And the point he's making in verses 8 to 13 is that all the things the Corinthians celebrate most are transitory. They don't last. Nothing lasts forever. Things come and go. They come together and they fall apart. They come together again and they fall apart again. What matters is faith, hope, and love. And the one thing that matters most is love. Because catch this reason. Love alone gives meaning to the otherwise unintelligible world. Love alone gives meaning to an otherwise unintelligible world. And so the title of this sermon is Love Never Fails, because that's the point that Paul is making. Real love never fails. Mature love never fails, even if it looks like it. In retrospect, when you look back at it, you know it actually didn't fail. But the best things you ever do without love are literally meaningless. And I would suggest that things that at first maybe seem not all that meaningful at all, if done with love, turn out to have deep meaning. Now, another thing Paul is saying is that all knowledge is partial. Now we know in part. Oh, I'm glad that one made it. Yeah. Here's my library. Here's my library. Well, really, it's not my library. It's the books that are on the floor because there's no room on the shelves. But it doesn't matter how many books you have if you don't have love. That's the point in all of these things. Paul is saying that we on this side of the resurrection only know in part and act consistently on the base of incomplete information. Think about it. That's what we do over and over again. On this side of the resurrection, we only know in part, and we act constantly on the base of incomplete information. And that is all the more reason why we need love. If you don't know what to do in a given circumstance, go with what you know is loving. And deep down inside, the heart almost always knows actually what is loving. But the main point that Paul is making throughout this letter to the feverish Corinthian church is that love involves character formation. It doesn't just happen, it takes learning. It's not just a matter of feelings. Feelings come and go, while the love that Paul is teaching lasts forever. And you can't just learn these things in a day's time. These are learned patterns of behavior that must be learned over time in the context of a loving community that models and supports such behavior. We must learn patience. Do you still struggle with patience? I do. Have you ever tried to learn it? We must be taught how not to keep score of the wrongs done to us. We have to learn to quit avoiding people that we're mad at. We have to learn to talk to them, to respect them again, to go to their houses when invited, to see them in all their flawed, outrageous humanity which we share with them. We have to learn to let things go and to extend to others the grace we know we need ourselves. And all of this is true whether we are speaking of churches or family or friendships. We have to learn to master anger. We have to learn not to be self-seeking. We have to learn not to be rude. We have to learn not to correct people in ways we would not wish to be corrected. And we have to do this. The church must be a place where these things are learned, or the church can never get on with its task of saving the world. And that is the task of the church. For much of the Christian evangelical world, John 3:16 is the text that makes the bumper stickers and everything. They don't get to John 3:17, where the point is the salvation of the world. I think of Wednesday evening classes around here are how to love classes. And right now this week, we're learning how to love the difficult person in our lives. You know, the loud opinionated uncle at the Thanksgiving table. You've got 4 weeks to get ready for him. The bosses who no one can ever really satisfy. The neighbor who scares all the children. And every neighborhood has one. Think about it. Do consider joining us. 7 o'clock, church library. Many of us do that online. Do that if you can. We have to be a church where these things are learned, or we can never get on with the task of saving the world. Otherwise, all of a church's energy gets used up in putting out our own emotional brush fires. And we never get on with rescuing the world, with instilling hope in children growing up everywhere, from Bridgeport to Gaza, with creating networks devoted to peace, with creating beside every network of terror, networks of love. But if we who try to follow Jesus are impatient with one another, if we are not kind to one another, if we envy one another, if we are constantly angry with one another, if we are habitually judging one another, if we are still resentful toward one another, then what hope is there? And that is what 1 Corinthians 13 is about. It's nothing sentimental. It's about saving the world. And love never fails. I wish there were a sign that said that, hanging up in Arabic in Hamas underground shelters. Love never fails. Hanging up in Hebrew in the Israeli Knesset out in the hills east of Jerusalem. Hanging up in Russian in the Kremlin outside Red Square in Moscow. And in that great room of the House of Representatives, where the House of Representatives meets in the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. I wish that was the sign. Love never fails. I wish it were hanging up in every church, synagogue, and mosque in America. I wish it would drive people back to learning how to do it. The call this morning is to life in the Spirit, to living ever more mindfully in a world lit by resurrection and open to the Spirit of God. It's the life you've always wanted. It will lead you to insights into ways of seeing life you've never had before, to depths and heights that you've never known before. It's a whole new world with a rich, fantastic point of view. Our lives are transformed. We are empowered in all that we do by God consciousness. We are never alone. You will feel immersed over and over again by the Spirit of God, God energy surging through you, a loving force field surrounding you. Faith is physiological. Hope is physiological. Love is physiological. You will be filled with unimaginable power. You will feel as if you can touch the heavens, and you will know so much more than you've ever known before, and be able to do so much more than you've ever done before. But if you are not ready for such a world, Paul is saying, if you do not have love. And that you can learn.